August 18, 1944. Fort Devens, Massachusetts. The snow fell silently over the sprawling prisoner of war camp, muffling the world in a blanket of white that seemed to erase the war itself. Inside Barracks 14, 32 German soldiers lay motionless in their bunks, eyes wide open in the darkness. The steam radiator hissed softly in the corner. Outside, no footsteps, no shouted commands, no rifle bolts clicking in the cold. For the first time since their capture 3 months prior at Salerno, there was no guard standing at their door. Oberstfreiter Klaus Hoffmann, formerly of the 16th Panzer Division, stared at the ceiling beams. His hands trembled beneath the wool blanket, not from cold, but from the impossible mathematics of freedom. An unlocked door. An absent sentry. In his mind, he calculated the distance to the tree line beyond the fence, estimated the depth of the snow, wondered if his weakened legs could carry him far enough before the inevitable bullets found his back. But he did not move. None of them moved. Because this silence, this absence of control, terrified them more than any guard ever could. This was not how captivity was supposed to work. For 4 years, the young men of the Wehrmacht had been taught a singular doctrine about capture, that it represented the ultimate failure, a fate worse than death itself. From the moment they swore their oaths to the Führer, they absorbed the mythology of the invincible German soldier who would rather perish than surrender. The enemy, they were told, would show no mercy. Capture meant torture, starvation, execution. The propaganda ministry had filled their heads with lurid stories of Soviet commissars executing prisoners with shovels, of British guards leaving wounded Germans to freeze in open fields, of American gangster soldiers who shot the defenseless for sport. When these men climbed onto ships in Naples harbor in September 1943, hands bound behind their backs and their stomachs hollow with hunger, they believed they were sailing toward their deaths. They had seen what remained of Italy after the Allied invasion, the bombed cities, the desperate civilians, the complete collapse of Mussolini's promises. If the Allies could do this to their Italian allies, what would they do to the Germans who had fought them so bitterly from Kasserine to the Gothic Line? The voyage across the Atlantic lasted 19 days. They were packed below decks in converted cargo holds, given minimal rations, watched constantly by armed MPs who spoke no German and showed no emotion. This confirmed everything they had been told. Oberstfreiter Hoffmann spent those 19 days mentally preparing for whatever came next. A labor camp in some frozen wasteland, perhaps, or simply a bullet in a New England forest where no one would ever find his body. What they encountered instead broke every framework they possessed for understanding the world. The trucks that carried them from Boston Harbor to Fort Devens drove through towns unchanged by war. Hoffmann pressed his face to the canvas covering, catching glimpses through the gap of a world that seemed to exist in a different dimension from the Europe he knew. Shop windows full of goods. Cars, civilian cars, moving freely on roads unbombed and intact. Children walking home from school with lunchboxes, laughing. No rubble. No craters. No evidence whatsoever that this nation had been fighting a global war for 2 years. The camp itself multiplied the cognitive dissonance. They had expected Stalag conditions, barbed wire, watchtowers, machine guns, mud. What they found was a settlement of clean wooden barracks arranged in neat rows, with electric lights, indoor plumbing, and heating systems that actually worked. The latrines were tiled. The showers produced hot water. Each man received 2 blankets, a pillow, a footlocker for personal items. The dining hall had windows. On that first night, they were served a meal that Hoffmann would remember for the rest of his life. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes with butter, green beans, white bread with jam, and coffee. Real coffee, not the acorn substitute they'd been drinking since 1942. The portions were not calculated to keep a man barely alive, but to satisfy actual hunger. Hoffmann ate slowly, waiting for the nausea, the stomach cramps that came from eating too much after months of semi-starvation. He watched the American guards leaning against the walls, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders, looking bored. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, a first-generation Irish-American from Boston, had been assigned to the German compound for 3 months. He would later recall in an interview for the National Archives that the new prisoners ate like they thought it was their last meal. Real quiet. Kept looking at us like we were going to take the plates away. Some of them cried. Just sat there with tears running down their faces, shoveling in potatoes. After the meal, a U.S. Army captain delivered an orientation speech through an interpreter. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. They would receive the same rations as American soldiers. They could send and receive mail. They could elect representatives to address grievances. They would work, the convention required it, but they would be paid in camp scrip for their labor. They could use this scrip to purchase cigarettes, toiletries, candy, beer. Hoffman almost laughed at the absurdity. They were prisoners of war, and their captors were offering them beer. The captain concluded with a statement that would become central to the American approach to German POWs. You are soldiers who fought for your country. That war is over for you now. While you are here, you will be treated as soldiers, not as criminals. We ask only that you follow the rules and cause no trouble. Then came the moment that shattered their understanding completely. The captain nodded to the guards, who filed out of the barracks. The interpreter said, "The door will remain unlocked. There will be no guard posted inside your barracks at night. You are confined to the building from lights out until morning roll call, but we will not lock you in. This is a matter of respect and trust." The door closed. No lock turned. No footsteps remained outside. The prisoners of Barracks 14 sat in stunned silence. Several men immediately went to the door, expecting to find it locked despite what they'd been told. Gefreiter Ernst Bauer pushed it open a crack, saw the empty corridor, closed it again. He looked at Hoffman with an expression of complete incomprehension. "It's a trick," someone whispered in the darkness. "They want to see who will try to escape. They're watching us." "With what?" another voice answered. "There's no one there." "Then it's a test. They're testing our discipline. Or our stupidity." The debate continued in hushed, urgent tones. Hoffman lay in his bunk and listened to his comrades construct elaborate theories to explain the inexplicable. The Americans had set up hidden cameras. There were microphones in the walls. The unlocked door was bait for a trap that would justify harsher treatment. It was psychological warfare designed to break their morale by offering illusory freedom. It was evidence that the Americans were incompetent and overconfident, which meant the war was not really lost, which meant Germany might still prevail, which meant their capture was temporary. None of them could accept the simpler explanation, that the door was unlocked because the Americans simply did not consider them a threat worth guarding that closely, that the abundance and confidence of American society was so profound that it could afford to treat enemy soldiers with a casual generosity that would have been unthinkable in the Reich. Hoffman did not sleep that first night. None of them did. They lay in their bunks, warm and well-fed, listening to the absence of guards, trying to reconcile the mythology of their training with the reality of their captivity. The cognitive dissonance only deepened as days became weeks. The work assignments began: agricultural labor for some, forestry for others, light manufacturing for those with relevant skills. Hoffman's group was sent to a local farm to help with the winter harvest of stored vegetables. They rode in the back of an open truck through the Massachusetts countryside, accompanied by a single guard who spent most of the journey reading a paperback novel. The farm belonged to the Kowalski family, Polish immigrants who had built a successful operation over 3 decades. Mrs. Kowalski, a woman in her 60s with hands weathered by labor, served the German prisoners' lunch in her kitchen. Sandwiches of ham and cheese on soft bread, apples from her cellar, coffee, and homemade cookies. She spoke to them in broken German, asked about their families, showed them photographs of her own sons, one in the Pacific, one in Italy. Hoffman could not process this. In Poland, German soldiers had requisitioned food from farmers at gunpoint, burned villages, executed civilians for sabotage. Here was a Polish woman, her homeland crushed under Wehrmacht boots, serving cookies to German soldiers and showing them pictures of her children. The moral universe made no sense. The work itself was neither brutal nor designed to humiliate. They loaded barrels of potatoes onto trucks. They sorted apples for storage. The guard, a corporal from Iowa named Jenkins, helped with the heavy lifting and shared his cigarettes during breaks. When one of the Germans slipped on ice and twisted his ankle, Jenkins drove him back to the camp infirmary himself, leaving the others unsupervised for 2 hours. "Aren't you worried we'll escape?" Bauer asked Jenkins through the interpreter. Jenkins shrugged. "Where would you go?" "Canada." "We'd find you in a day." "Mexico." "That's a long walk. Besides, why would you? 3 meals a day, warm bed, no one shooting at you. You guys got it better than half the farms around here." This casual assessment contained a truth that the German prisoners could barely articulate. By the material standards of life, they were indeed better off as POWs in America than they would have been as soldiers in Germany, or as civilians in the bombed-out cities of the Reich. The cognitive dissonance between their ideological training and their lived experience created a psychological rupture that would reshape their understanding of the world. The details of daily life in the camp accumulated into an overwhelming body of evidence that challenged every assumption they carried. The library stocked with books in German, not propaganda, but actual literature, philosophy, technical manuals. The camp newspaper, printed in German, that reported war news honestly, including German defeats. The recreation yard with volleyball nets and equipment for handball. The canteen where they could purchase chocolate bars, razor blades, writing paper, cigarettes, not the rationed, low-quality substitutes of the Reich, but American products of impossible abundance. Coffee became a symbol of this abundance. Real coffee, available every day, sometimes twice a day. In Germany, coffee had been replaced by substitutes made from acorns, barley, chicory, a bitter reminder of the blockade and the failing war economy. Here, Hoffman drank real coffee at breakfast, while American guards drank the same coffee from the same urns. The equality was casual, unremarked upon, total. Feldwebel Otto Kraus, the senior NCO in Barracks 14, had fought on the Eastern Front before his transfer to Italy. He had seen the aftermath of the Soviet counteroffensives, the desperate winters, the collapse of supply lines. He had watched men eat their leather belts and boil grass for soup. He had participated in requisitions from Ukrainian villages where children starved while Wehrmacht granaries bulged with confiscated grain. Now he sat in an American POW camp, drinking real coffee, eating roasted meat, sleeping in a heated room with no lice, and slowly coming to terms with a devastating realization. Germany was not losing the war because of some temporary setback or betrayal. Germany was losing the war because it had challenged an enemy whose productive capacity was so vast, whose societal wealth was so deep, that it could afford to feed enemy prisoners better than the Reich fed its own soldiers. The mathematics of defeat became visible in every meal, every warm shower, every casual gesture of plenty. The unlocked door remained the most powerful symbol of this new reality. After a week, the prisoners stopped discussing it. After 2 weeks, they stopped thinking about it consciously. But it worked on their minds in ways that no amount of propaganda could have countered. The psychology was subtle but profound. A locked door reinforces the prisoner's understanding of his captivity. The force that constrains him is external, physical, absolute. But an unlocked door transfers the burden of captivity to the prisoner's own choice. The Americans were saying, implicitly, "We do not need to lock you in because you will lock yourselves in. You understand that escape is pointless, that the world outside offers you nothing better than what you have here, that your imprisonment is a matter of mathematical reality rather than physical coercion." This represented a form of power that the Wehrmacht had never contemplated in its training manuals, the power of abundance, of confidence, of a system so secure in its superiority that it did not need to demonstrate constant control. The Reich had ruled through fear, surveillance, the ever-present threat of punishment. The Americans ruled through full stomachs and unlocked doors. Hoffmann began to dream differently. In the early weeks, his dreams had been of home, of his village in Bavaria, of his mother's kitchen and the church bells on Sunday. But as winter deepened into 1944, his dreams transformed. He dreamed of being back in the war, of watching American tanks roll across fields while German guns ran out of ammunition. He dreamed of being hungry again, truly hungry, with the hollow aching emptiness he'd felt in Italy. He dreamed of guards locking doors, of being controlled again in ways that made sense. He woke from these dreams into the warm darkness of Barracks 14, heard the steam radiator hissing, smelled the coffee already brewing in the mess hall for breakfast, and felt a terror he could not name. The terror of ideological collapse. The terror of having been lied to completely. The terror of fighting for years in service of a regime whose promises had been exposed as hollow by the simple fact of 3 meals a day and an unlocked door. Letters from home made the contrast sharper. The mail system worked efficiently. Packages and letters arrived within 4 to 6 weeks, faster than military post had ever reached the front lines. Hoffmann received his first letter from his mother in late February. She wrote carefully, aware that censors would read her words, but the meaning came through clearly. Rationing had tightened again. The bombing had intensified. His youngest brother, Peter, had been conscripted at 16. The church had been damaged in a raid. She missed him terribly and prayed for his safety. Hoffmann sat in the recreation room, surrounded by men playing cards and reading, and tried to write a response. What could he say? That he was warm and well-fed? That he ate meat 3 times a week? That he had gained 15 pounds? That his captors treated him better than his own officers ever had? The words seemed like betrayal. He finally wrote a brief, generic note about his health and his hope that the war would end soon. Gefreiter Bauer received a letter from his wife in Hamburg. The apartment building had burned in a firestorm raid. She and the children had survived but lost everything. They were living in a school basement with 40 other families. Food consisted of turnips and black bread. The children had lice. She did not know how they would survive the winter. Bauer read this letter aloud to Hoffmann and Krauss, his voice shaking. She says she's glad I'm in America. Glad I was captured. She says at least I'm alive and not hungry. He looked up at them with tears running down his face. My wife is grateful that I'm a prisoner. What kind of world is this? The question had no answer. Or rather, it had an answer that none of them wanted to speak aloud. A world where the ideology they had fought for had led to absolute disaster, and where defeat had brought them better conditions than victory could have provided. The camp administration implemented a program of re-education, though they did not call it that. Documentary films were shown in the recreation hall, footage of liberated concentration camps, of the destruction in Europe of American industrial production. Discussion groups were organized, voluntary but subtly encouraged. American officers gave lectures on democratic government, on free markets, on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The prisoners attended these sessions with varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity. Many initially dismissed it as propaganda, no different from the films they'd been shown by the SS about Jewish conspiracies and Bolshevik atrocities. But the cognitive framework for dismissing American claims had been steadily eroded by the accumulation of physical evidence. How could they dismiss American assertions about productive capacity when they ate the proof 3 times a day? How could they reject claims about the superiority of democratic systems when they experienced the casual humanity of that system in every unlocked door? Hoffman attended a lecture by a U.S. Army captain named Robert Miller, a professor of history from the University of Chicago in civilian life. Miller spoke in fluent German about the European Enlightenment, about the philosophical foundations of liberal democracy, about the relationship between individual freedom and national prosperity. He did not condemn the prisoners or lecture them about guilt. He simply laid out an alternative understanding of how societies could function. "The door to your barracks is unlocked," Miller said, "not because we are naive or weak, but because we do not need to lock it. A system built on freedom is stronger than a system built on control, because freedom creates wealth and innovation, while control creates only fear and stagnation. You are seeing this principle in action. Everything you experience here, the food, the heat, the medicine, the respect, comes from a society that trusts its citizens and unleashes their potential. What you experienced in Germany came from a society that feared its citizens and crushed their potential." The lecture disturbed Hoffman more than any locked door could have. Because it made sense. Because it explained the inexplicable abundance, the casual confidence, the unlocked doors. Because it suggested that everything he had believed, everything he had fought for, had been not just wrong but backwards, a system designed to produce the opposite of what it promised. Spring came to Massachusetts with the sudden violence of northern climates, snow melting into rushing streams, mud everywhere, then sudden green exploding across the landscape. The prisoners were sent to help local farmers with spring planting. Hoffman found himself working alongside Italian POWs who had been captured a year earlier. The Italians had adapted more quickly, learned more English, integrated themselves more fully into the camp economy. They joked with the guards, flirted with the nurses in the infirmary, organized elaborate soccer tournaments. One of the Italians, a former corporal named Giuseppe, took Hoffman aside during a break. They communicated in broken German and Italian, supplemented with gestures. "You Germans," Giuseppe said, "you still think you're going to win. You still think this is temporary. Look around. The war is over for us. This is life now. And it's not bad, eh? Food, work, no one killing us. When I go home to Naples, it will be worse than this. Bombed buildings, no food, fascisti hiding in the hills. Here is better." Hoffman wanted to argue, to defend his nation's honor, to insist that surrender and acceptance were different from the stoic endurance of temporary captivity. But the words died in his throat. Because Giuseppe was right. The Americans had created a system where captivity was materially superior to freedom in a war-torn Europe. The symbolic power of this fact was devastating. The unlocked door was no longer just a door. It had become a metaphor for the entire American system, a demonstration that true power did not require constant displays of force, that genuine confidence could afford gestures of trust, that abundance created its own form of control far more effective than barbed wire or guards. In June 1944, news of the Normandy invasion reached the camp. The prisoners gathered around the radio in the recreation hall, listening to German-language broadcasts from both sides. The Wehrmacht communique spoke of heroic resistance and temporary setbacks. The American broadcasts spoke of overwhelming force and inevitable victory. The prisoners knew which version was true because they could do the math. They saw the trucks, the supplies, the casual waste of plenty. They knew that if America could feed prisoners like kings, it could supply an invasion force that would crush anything in its path. Feldwebel Kraus stood at the window that night, looking out at the campgrounds bathed in security lights. "We lost this war in 1941, he said quietly. "The moment we failed to defeat the Soviets before winter. The moment Japan brought America into the fight. Everything since then has been just working through the arithmetic of our defeat." Hoffman joined him at the window. "When do you think we'll be sent home?" "Who knows? A year. 2. Does it matter? What are we going home to?" The question hung in the air. What were they going home to? Cities reduced to rubble. An economy destroyed. A society that would be occupied, controlled, reshaped by the victors. The door to their barracks was unlocked, but the door to their former lives had been blown off its hinges by a war that should never have been started. "I have a brother who's 14, Hoffman said. "He writes me letters about wanting to join the Volkssturm, to defend the fatherland. He still believes the propaganda. I can't figure out how to tell him the truth without breaking his heart." "Maybe broken hearts are what we need," Krauss replied. "Maybe we need to break completely before we can rebuild into something better." The months accumulated. Summer in New England brought different work: forestry, road maintenance, construction projects. The prisoners received news of the failed July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler, of the Soviet advance into Poland, of Paris liberated, of the German border breached. Each piece of news confirmed what they already knew in their bones. The Reich was dying, and they were watching it die from a place of safety and plenty that made the watching almost unbearable. Hoffman worked on a construction crew rebuilding a bridge outside a small town called Concord. The foreman was a civilian contractor, a man in his 50s named Tom Patterson, who had learned German from his grandmother. Patterson treated the POW labor force exactly as he treated his American workers, with a mixture of gruff competence and casual egalitarianism. When a German prisoner named Schmidt demonstrated an aptitude for carpentry, Patterson spent extra time teaching him advanced techniques. "You're good with your hands," Patterson told Schmidt. "After the war, you could make a living with skills like this. Carpenters always find work." The comment was casual, throwaway, but it contained a revolution in thought. After the war. Not if you survive, not if you return, but a simple assumption of continuity and future. The Americans saw the German prisoners not as eternal enemies or subhuman opponents, but as men who would return to civilian life and need skills to support themselves. The practical humanism was more powerful than any ideological argument. During lunch breaks, Hoffman and Patterson sometimes talked about philosophy, history, the war. Patterson had fought in the First World War, had seen the trenches, had absorbed the lessons of that conflict. "Same thing happened then," Patterson said. "You guys were told you were fighting for civilization against barbarism. We were told the same thing. Turns out we were all fighting for, I don't even know what. National pride? Imperial ambition?" And when it was over, the guys who did the fighting realized they had more in common with each other than with the politicians who sent them to fight. Hoffman thought about this during the long summer evenings, sitting outside the barracks as the sun set over the Massachusetts hills. He thought about the door that remained unlocked every night, about the bridge he was building, about the coffee he drank each morning, about the letters from home describing a world falling apart while he lived in abundance. He thought about the Reich's promises of greatness and glory, and how those promises had led to this: German soldiers building American bridges while German cities burned. The coffee became his meditation, his measure of meaning. Each morning, he held the cup in his hands, felt the warmth, inhaled the rich aroma, and thought about the supply chains that had brought this coffee from some distant plantation to his hands. The ships, the trains, the factories, the infrastructure of a nation so wealthy it could afford to give real coffee to enemy prisoners while fighting a global war on multiple continents. The coffee was a symbol of everything the Reich had promised but failed to deliver: abundance, confidence, a system that worked. Winter returned. A year since their arrival. The war ground toward its inevitable conclusion. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's final offensive, ended in disaster. The Soviets crossed the Oder. The Allies crossed the Rhine. The camp received a new influx of prisoners, younger men conscripted in the desperate final months, some barely 17 years old. These new prisoners arrived with the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen the absolute collapse of everything they knew. Hoffman found himself in the strange position of being a veteran prisoner, explaining the system to the newcomers, telling them about the unlocked doors and the abundance and the casual humanity of their captors. The new prisoners did not believe him. They thought it was a trick, or that he had become a collaborator, or that he had lost his mind. He understood their skepticism. He remembered his own first night, lying awake in disbelief, unable to reconcile reality with expectation. "Just wait," he told them. "Just watch. You'll see." One of the new prisoners, a boy named Dieter who looked about 16, approached Hoffman after dinner on his second night. "They served us meat," Dieter said, his voice shaking. "Real meat. And bread. And the guard helped me when I spilled my coffee. He just got a towel and cleaned it up. Like it was nothing. Like I was a person." "You are a person," Hoffman said. "That's what they keep trying to tell us. We're all just people." Dieter started crying. Not the quiet, suppressed tears of a soldier trying to maintain dignity, but the raw, uncontrolled sobbing of a child. "I watched my squad die last month. We had no ammunition, no food, no hope. The officer shot himself rather than order a retreat. I surrendered because I wanted to live, and I thought the Americans would shoot me, and I didn't care because at least it would be quick. But they didn't shoot me. They gave me food. They gave me a bed. They gave me coffee. Why are they doing this?" Hoffman put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Because they can afford to. Because they don't need to be cruel. Because their system works and ours didn't." The words felt like heresy and truth simultaneously. April 1945. The news of Roosevelt's death spread through the camp with genuine sadness among the prisoners. They had come to see Roosevelt as a symbol of the benevolent power that held them, firm but fair, powerful but humane. The irony of German soldiers mourning an American president was not lost on Hoffman. A year and a half earlier, they would have celebrated such news as a potential turning point in the war. Now they grieved because they had internalized, despite themselves, a grudging respect for the system that had defeated them. Then came the photographs from Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The camp administration did not hide these images. They posted them in the recreation hall, required prisoners to view them, held discussions about what they meant. The cognitive dissonance reached its final, shattering crescendo. The regime they had served, the system they had believed in, had built factories of death. While they had been eating 3 meals a day and playing volleyball, their countrymen had been systematically murdering millions. The unlocked door took on new meaning. The Americans had known what the German regime represented, had seen the evidence of its crimes, and still they had chosen to treat German prisoners with humanity. Not because the prisoners deserved it, Hoffman understood this now, but because the Americans were making a statement about their own values. The open door was a demonstration that civilization could remain civilized even toward enemies who had served evil. Feldwebel Kraus sat in the barracks that night, staring at his hands. "We didn't know," he said quietly. "Some did, but most of us, we didn't know." "Does it matter?" someone replied. "We served it. We fought for it. We made it possible." The conversation died there. What was there to say? They had been defeated militarily, ideologically, and morally. The American system of captivity, the abundance, the unlocked doors, the casual humanity, had not just defeated them but exposed the utter bankruptcy of everything they had fought for. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war was officially over. The camp administration organized an announcement ceremony. The prisoners assembled in the yard, uncertain how to process this moment. They had known it was coming for months, but the finality still struck with the force of revelation. The war that had consumed their youth, that had promised glory and delivered devastation, was finished. They had lost completely. Captain Miller, the history professor, delivered a speech. "The war is over," he said in German. "Your nation has been defeated. But you men are not your nation. You are individuals who will go home someday and help rebuild a different Germany. A democratic Germany. A Germany that can live in peace with its neighbors. The door to your barracks has been unlocked for 18 months. Consider it a preview of the freedom you will have a chance to build when you return home." The symbolism was explicit now, stated plainly rather than implied. The unlocked door had been a pedagogy, a lesson taught through experience rather than lecture. You can be free without being dangerous. You can be trusted without being controlled. Security comes not from locks and guards, but from full stomachs and hope for the future. Hoffman stood in formation, listening to these words, and felt something crack inside him, the last resistance of ideology against lived experience. The Reich had promised strength through unity, prosperity through conquest, glory through war. It had delivered none of these things. The Americans had promised nothing, had simply treated him like a human being, and in doing so had demonstrated a form of power more profound than anything he had known. That night, the door to Barracks 14 remained unlocked, as it had every night. But for the first time, Hoffman understood that the door had always been unlocked in a deeper sense. The Americans had unlocked the ideological prison of his mind simply by showing him an alternative, a system that worked, that created abundance, that trusted its citizens and even its enemies. He lay in his bunk and thought about the future. Home eventually, though home was an abstraction now, a country that would be occupied, reorganized, rebuilt by the victors. He thought about his family, his village, his mother who had written about praying for his safety. He was safe. He had been safe for 18 months while his country burned. The guilt and relief of this fact were inseparable. The repatriation process began slowly. The camp administration prioritized the sick, the elderly, those with family emergencies. Hoffman would not be sent home until early 1946. The months between the end of the war and his departure had a strange, liminal quality. They were no longer exactly prisoners, but not exactly free. They existed in a space between worlds, between identities. The work continued. There were still crops to plant, bridges to repair, roads to maintain. The American economy, transitioning from war to peace, still needed the labor. The prisoners were paid slightly more now, given additional privileges. Some were allowed supervised visits to nearby towns. Hoffman went once, walking down the main street of a small Massachusetts town, looking in shop windows full of goods, watching American families go about their lives as if the greatest war in history had been a minor interruption rather than an existential crisis. In a bookstore, he found a copy of Tocqueville's Democracy in America in German translation. He purchased it with his camp scrip and read it slowly over several weeks. Tocqueville wrote about the American character, about the relationship between equality and liberty, about how democratic systems generated prosperity through the unleashing of individual energy. The American believes that his own success is connected to the success of his community, and that the freedom of others enhances rather than diminishes his own freedom. Hoffman thought about the unlocked door, about Sergeant O'Brien, who had been bored by guard duty because he saw no threat worth guarding against. About Tom Patterson, who had taught carpentry to enemy soldiers because he saw future citizens rather than permanent enemies. About the entire system that had treated him not as an object to be controlled, but as a person to be respected, even in defeat. The coffee remained his daily meditation. Each morning he performed the ritual. Receive the cup, feel the warmth, inhale the aroma, taste the richness. Let it symbolize everything that had changed. The coffee was abundant while Germany had starved. The coffee was freely given while the Reich had taken everything by force. The coffee was a gesture of humanity that had done more to defeat Nazi ideology than any propaganda campaign could have achieved. January 1946. Nearly 2 years since that first night in Barracks 14. The order came. His group would ship out in 2 weeks, bound for a repatriation camp in France, then home to Germany. Hoffman packed his few belongings, some books, letters, photographs he'd been allowed to have. He said goodbye to the Italian prisoners, who would remain longer. He shook hands with Sergeant O'Brien, who was being discharged and returning to Boston. "What will you do?" O'Brien asked. "When you get home?" "I don't know," Hoffman admitted. "Whatever is needed. Build. Work. Try to make something better." "That's all any of us can do," O'Brien said. "War's over. Time to live now." The night before departure, Hoffman lay in his bunk for the last time. The door was unlocked. It had been unlocked for 730 nights. He had never once tried to open it after lights out, had never once tested the boundary. The Americans had been right. The physical door did not matter. The real prison and the real freedom existed in the mind. He thought about what he would tell his brother Peter, who had survived the war and was now 17, old enough to understand. He would tell him about the unlocked door, about the coffee, about the American system that had defeated them not just with weapons, but with abundance and confidence and a casual humanity that made revenge seem petty. He would tell him that democracy was not weakness, that freedom was not chaos, that prosperity came from trust rather than control. The steam radiator hissed softly. Outside, somewhere in the American night, families slept peacefully in homes untouched by war. Factories stood ready to convert from military to civilian production. Universities prepared to welcome students under the GI Bill. A nation built on unlocked doors prepared to reshape the world according to its values. Hoffman closed his eyes and tried to imagine the Germany he would return to. Rubble and occupation, certainly. Hunger and hardship, probably. But also, perhaps, a chance to rebuild something different. A chance to create a system where doors could remain unlocked because citizens were trusted, where abundance came from productivity rather than conquest, where strength meant confidence rather than control. The door to Barracks 14 remained unlocked through the final night, as it always had, as it always would. A symbol, a lesson, a promise. The Americans had demonstrated their power not by building higher walls but by removing doors. Not by tightening control but by extending trust. Not by revenge but by respect. In the morning, Hoffman would board a ship for Europe, would return to a defeated nation, would begin the long process of reconstruction and redemption. But he would carry with him the memory of those 730 nights, of the door that remained open, of the coffee that tasted like freedom, of the simple but profound lesson that a system built on trust was stronger than any system built on fear. The ship departed Boston Harbor on a gray January morning. Hoffman stood at the rail, watching America recede into the distance. He thought about the camp, the unlocked door, the 2 years of captivity that had been materially better than the years of freedom that preceded them. He thought about the future, uncertain and daunting. He thought about the choice that lay ahead for his nation, whether to learn the lesson of the unlocked door or to retreat into the resentment of defeat. History would show that the American approach to German prisoners of war was not naive idealism but calculated strategy. The humane treatment, the material abundance, the respect shown to defeated soldiers, all of it served a purpose beyond simple Geneva Convention compliance. The Americans were making an investment in the peace. They understood that the way you treat defeated enemies shapes the world that comes after war. Lock the doors, starve the prisoners, treat them with cruelty, and you create a generation seeking revenge. Leave the doors unlocked, provide abundance, show respect, and you create a generation that might choose a different path. The coffee, the open door, the casual trust, these were not weaknesses but the most powerful weapons in the American arsenal. They demonstrated a form of strength that did not require constant displays of force, a form of control that did not require surveillance and coercion, a form of victory that did not require humiliation of the defeated. Hoffman never forgot that first night in Barracks 14, lying awake in the darkness, terrified by the absence of guards. The fear had been real, but it had been the fear of transformation, the fear of having every certainty stripped away, the fear of discovering that everything he had believed was wrong. The Americans had defeated him not on the battlefield, but in that moment when he realized that the door would remain unlocked because it did not need to be locked, because he and his fellow prisoners were no threat to a system so confident and abundant that it could afford gestures of trust toward its enemies. Years later, living in the rebuilt Federal Republic of Germany, working as a carpenter, raising children who would never know war, Hoffman would tell his story to anyone who would listen. He would describe the camp, the food, the work, the respect. And always he would return to the door. The unlocked door that symbolized everything about the American system, everything about the defeat of fascism, everything about the possibility of building societies based on trust rather than fear. They didn't need to lock the door, he would say, because they had already unlocked something more important. They showed us that another way was possible. That freedom and prosperity were connected. That strength came from confidence rather than control. The door was just wood and hinges. What it represented was a different kind of power, the power of a system that worked so well it could afford to trust even its enemies. The ship sailed on through the gray Atlantic waters, carrying its cargo of prisoners toward an uncertain future. Behind them lay America, land of unlocked doors and abundant coffee. Ahead lay Europe, waiting to be rebuilt. And in the minds of men like Klaus Hoffmann, a seed had been planted, the understanding that true strength does not require constant demonstrations of power, that genuine security comes from full stomachs and hope rather than from guards and locked doors, that the most profound victories are won not on battlefields, but in the transformation of hearts and minds. The door had remained unlocked for 730 nights. Each night had been a lesson. Each morning had been a revelation. And in the aggregate, those unlocked nights had accomplished what no amount of military occupation could achieve. They had shown that democracy was not a weakness but a strength, that freedom was not chaos but prosperity, that the American system had defeated the Reich not just militarily but morally and ideologically. Hoffman stood at the ship's rail, watching the American coast disappear into mist and memory. He touched the small notebook in his pocket where he had written his thoughts during the long nights in Barracks 14. Someday, he thought, when the world was ready to listen, he would tell this story. The story of how an unlocked door defeated an ideology, how a cup of coffee became a symbol of freedom, how casual trust accomplished what coercion never could. The ship sailed on. The door remained unlocked, even now, even in memory. And in that unlocked door lay the truth about power and freedom and the systems we build, that the strongest societies are those confident enough to trust, abundant enough to give, and secure enough to leave doors open because they have already won the only war that truly matters, the war for the hearts and minds of those who must choose what future to build from the ruins of the past.